Good evening, everyone. I'm Nayyera Haq. I currently serve as the host of The World Tonight on the Black News Channel. It's a new startup cable company. I also serve as chief foreign affairs correspondent and a host on Sirius XM Progress. Now, that's several jobs, and we'll get into the idea of a journalist having several jobs as part of our conversation with my dear friend, Elie Mystal. You may know him as the justice correspondent for The Nation, but he has a new book out that's very provocative. It's called Allow Me to Retort: A Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution. Elie, I'm glad that we could chop it up tonight.
Thank you so much for doing this with us. Thank you so much for all these students who have come out today. And thank you so much for your interest in journalism. It's what we need in our country right now. What you're interested in couldn't be more important. It could pay better, but it couldn't be more important. So thank you guys so much for coming.
I think a lot about the idea of the story we tell about ourselves as a nation, the mythology of the nation, the stories we tell about ourselves. You and I both have non-traditional pathways to journalism. Mine came out of being an expert, learning government from the inside out first. I worked Congress, State Department, so I know both sides of the political equation. And then I wanted to tell people about it. And I had to piece together avenues and opportunities for people to want to know the things and the perspectives I had to share. Elie, how did you come to be a talking head on TV?
You know, I won my first job. I mean, literally, I won my first job in an online contest as I was transitioning from law to journalism. I worked for a time for a local publication called City Hall News. Now it's called City and State News. That job I got through sending out my cover letter, basically all across town, being like, I've got 2 Harvard degrees and I'm willing to work for free. Somebody should hire me. And they did hire me for free. And that was great. But my first big break came from Above the Law, where to hire a new editor, they had an online contest where we had to blog for the website, and then the readers would vote us off every week, American Idol style, and I won the job. Now, it should be said, because of how it worked, we were anonymous as we were doing this blogging, right? So we had to pick avatars for our stuff, right? And so before the contest starts, I'm trying to choose between 2 different ones. I've got Pinky and the Brain. I got the Brain from Pinky and the Brain because I love that little cartoon and I think it's really funny and it's kind of like my mascot. So I have the Brain. That's my one idea. My other is this like awesome statue of Shaka Zulu that I own. It was just Shaka just doing his thing, right? But I couldn't decide like which avatar I wanted to use. My mother said, do you want to make a statement or do you want to win? I was like, well, I would quite like to win if that was possible. Well, then I think you know who your avatar is going to be. And in fact, I did, right? Because I knew that being openly Black, to use a Don Lemon phrase, openly Black in a situation where I didn't have to be, in a situation where nobody knew me, where I wasn't established, wasn't going to help me win an online contest. And most of the readers assumed I was white during the contest until I actually won.
I had a similar awareness, but I had to navigate it a little differently. Mine was apply for an internship on Capitol Hill. You're going to work for free and just hope that somebody likes you enough to maybe consider you for a job. And I knew that my name on a resume, my name is Nayyera Haq. This is a couple of years before 9/11, right? So that nobody was going to pick that resume out of a pile. It was just the early side of all the studies that said that people immediately, if they can't pronounce the name, they just move your resume off the table. So really navigated who did I know where, who can make a phone call, who can get me the internship. And once I got the internship, like I can't leave, because if I leave, how do I get back in? I know I want to be in government. Like I want to be in the system and I want to understand this place that, and this system that was good for my immigrant parents. But if I step out now that I have my foot in the door, I'm not going to be able to get back in. So there's that realization that my path was never going to be that straight meritocracy path that we keep getting told exists in the United States. I mean, I'm talking like I was 17 years old and aware of that. Fast forward nearly 20 years, I spent time in and out of campaigns and federal government, ended up working at the White House, Obama administration, all of that, thinking we've elected the first Black president, right? Like I can be a little bit more myself. And I'm still that petite Asian woman who was told by a primetime network producer that I just didn't look like a national security professional. I'm like, oh, so that negotiating with the Taliban thing I did before we were even allowed to talk about
something about your jaw thing, just doesn't have that, the squareness of your jib just doesn't vibe.
That's what it is. Right? It just doesn't, that does not qualify. So you then, from that moment of the avatar and you started writing, you now have taken that writing, built a career off it, and now have a book. And the book, as I mentioned, Allow Me to Retort, a Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution. How did you land on putting the word Black in the title of your book?
Because it's about perspective, right? My book is a Black Guy's Guide. It's not a guide for Black people. One of the things that I noticed as I was going through my legal career, so this is before my job, because I'm in my second career, right? Third career because I'm a dad, really. But my first career was as a lawyer, and one of the things that I noticed going through law school, going through the legal profession, was that most people who talked about the law didn't look like me. Most people were white. Most people were white males. Over the years, white women have gotten a foothold in that industry, although they're still underrepresented. But overall, it's a blindingly white bar that gets to report on Supreme Court news. Even if you guys, you students think about who you've heard telling you about a Supreme Court decision, right? It's Jeff Toobin, it's Pete Williams, it's Nina Totenberg, maybe, right? Maybe Dahlia Lithwick if you're actually really paying attention. But it ain't nobody Black, it ain't nobody with melanin, right? Because that profession tends to be very white-based. Well, I thought that was interesting, given that so often what the Supreme Court is deciding is whether or not people who look like me have rights. And it felt to me like somebody with skin in the game, literally, should be part of the voice, part of the narrative, and explaining to people what the Supreme Court did. So when I finally got to the point where I could write my own book, you best believe that my book is about the constitutions and the laws that we live under from the perspective of a person the Constitution was designed to ignore and enslave. That's key to my understanding of this document.
But you came to that, as you mentioned, some parental advice. Your mom said, do you want to make a statement or do you want to win? Maybe for you and I, some of this is about where we are, the age. I'm in my 40s, right? I've got kids. Like at some point, I'm done contorting myself to fit these other boxes, but I did it for long enough to check those boxes as well. What was your point where you're like, no, I need to go out and start to make the change. I can no longer just exist in this pathway that people have told me works.
Michael Brown. Also, I have a friend online is that Michael Brown is when the okie doke got woke. There was a box I was willing to live within before Michael Brown was murdered. And after Michael Brown was murdered, I was like, this doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel authentic anymore. Trying to keep up appearances and trying to play this legal game within the box white people have set for me stopped feeling like stopped feeling like a good use of my time. And I think that through that moment, through that movement, through the Black Lives Matter movement, kind of seeing that start, hearing the pushback against it, and realizing from my perspective that there wasn't nearly enough legal conversation around how the laws are actually designed to exclude the value or to diminish the value of Black people. I found more and more and more of my voice. I always had the cynicalness, right? Like I was always had that kind of like, really, is this the best we can do? I always had that kind of sensibility, right? But in terms of this is what I actually should be doing with my career, that really started to change after that murder. And then certainly kind of as we go forward, we elect, as you said, you ended your story with, and then we elected the first Black president, and you thought that things would be better, and then it still kind of wasn't. For me, it was like, I didn't necessarily think things would be all that much better. I thought they would improve, but not all, But I never expected that the reaction to the first Black president would be an orange, bigoted con man fool. Like, that took me by surprise. I thought that we were beyond what it turned out we were not beyond by 2016.
So, you know, I despite all of my work for the Democratic Party and working in the White House for Obama, I did see that coming. And because I grew up in a suburban cop fireman office town, like I grew up with people like I grew up with what Trump was tapping into, and the quiet parts that you may not have heard are things that I used to hear at my friends' houses for dinner.
So I think I've told you this. I think I told you this offline, but like my one of my favorite stories about the Trump's victory is that the people who were most shocked were people like me, educated Black men. We were the ones who were most just like, I can't believe Chad did this.
No, I feel like white liberal New Yorkers were more surprised than you. There was that great Saturday Night Live sketch with Dave Chappelle and Tom Hanks, and they're like, yeah, like you're all devastated. Like, what did you think was happening right now in this country?
Women of color knew what was up. Women of color knew what was up. Women of color saw this coming. Women of color were just like, told you about Becky. Told you can't trust her. Like, they were on it in a way that I felt like Black educated Black men were not. Yeah, by the way, and poor Black men were on it, right? Like, my friends from the old neighborhood, the ones who didn't go to law school and whatever, they also were just like, I think that's they were also not surprised, I guess, about how racist this country can be. So anyway, the point is that also was I don't want to say coming out moment, but certainly put like this. On election night, I'm sitting devastated like everybody else. And I turn to my wife, election night 2016, and I say, I'm going to have to start writing some things that might end up with me getting fired and might end up with me going to jail. And we're just going to have to be okay with that.
I didn't know you had that conversation because I had a similar one too, to be honest. Mine was, well, first I went into labor. So that was kid number one. I was kind of due. I was actually kind of overdue, but that definitely sent me over. Went into labor. But I remember I'm pacing. I wasn't allowed to go to the hospital because you may or may not learn this at some point, students, but there's like a whole dilation thing that happens. And I was not dilated enough. So I'm just like pacing. I'm pacing. It's we know Hillary has lost. We're just waiting to see what she's going to say at what point at like 3 or 4 in the morning. And I'm just pacing around and I'm like, babe, we've seen what this has said about Muslim families, what he said. And now he's going to implement all of this stuff. And now we got to, I don't know, we're going to have a baby now. And like, do I stop or do I keep going? Because now I'm going to have a target on my back. I have a security clearance. Like, that's definitely getting, like, something's going to happen with that. And I guess we opted to dig in and go for it. He's like, you need to be able to be yourself and live your life. And I've got your back. So both you and I had support in that choice, but I had no idea that night was the same conversation for both of us, that awareness of journalists and people who speak truth or speak a perspective put targets on themselves. And that's where I want to, this next piece of the conversation is the institution of journalism and storytelling, how that changed in the last 4 or 5 years. And I'm not convinced we've settled from that change, right? Because there's the give the people what they want. There's the idea of be objective in what you write. And objectivity means that you have to equally balance what you're hearing. You need both sides. And I'm deeply emphasizing those words because you'll hear about objectivity, both sides, and, whataboutism. And I'm not convinced that did the service that journalism is supposed to do of informing the public of what the power systems are doing, nor do I think that is best for the truth. Is there such a thing as full objectivity?
I think people use the word objectivity wrong. I write about the law. People think the law is objective. It is not objective. The law is, by its nature, an adversarial process. The law can be applied objectively. And so when I think about my own work, it's not just that I would never say that I am objective. I would say that I am objective from my perspective. right? I try to be objective.
There's a lens. You bring a lens to the
right?
conversation,
and I try
and
to
you can
use
widen
that lens
the aperture, or you can
objectively, right? But the idea that like I don't have skin in the game, that I don't have a preference, that I don't have a bias when it comes to certain things is just ridiculous. I will say very openly, I have a pro-democracy bias in my coverage, right? Mm-hmm. I have a pro-science bias in my coverage. I have a pro-empathy bias in my coverage, and I have a pro-equality bias in my coverage. And if that makes people think that I am not objective enough to work at the whatever big mainstream organization that you can think of, then I say, screw you, because that's what they should be doing. They should also have a pro-democracy, pro-equality, pro-fairness bias in their reporting. And if you don't, you're doing it wrong. So no, I objectivity, it comes from how you apply that pro-democracy bias, right? So that if I find the Democrats are being anti-democratic, I'll call that out just as easily as I'll call out Republicans for being anti-democratic. But the subjectivity is that democracy, self-determination is good. I'm not ashamed of that.
In that way, are we returning a bit to that older style of journalism in which there was a sense that you're poking and digging, you're investigating and trying to figure out these things that the powers that be don't want you to know about, right? And somewhere along the way, it got a little bit more corporate than that. It became about objectivity is keeping a certain group of people happy. And all, I think, institutions fall into that, right? They cater to an audience. You say, this is our key audience. New York Times has really had to adapt to that in recent years because they realized that objectivity ended up becoming code for white men born in the 70s, right? Or like who came of age, and not even born, white men who came of age in the 70s and brought that lens of society to their coverage. And it didn't actually reflect New York City, right? It reflected a certain segment of Manhattan and not New York City, even the metro section. So I think that's some of the recognizing and changing the idea of your audience and adapting accordingly. But what you're suggesting is that for journalists, for people like us, there is an audience beyond the demographic of your readership, right? There is a purpose to this that makes it a profession, that makes it about the ethics of journalism rather than about selling papers or getting clicks. And that's the fourth estate, right? The principles of what media is intended to do.
Look, the point, from my perspective, the point of journalism is to tell the truth. Mm-hmm. And you can tell the truth as an investigative journalist. You can tell the truth as a columnist. You can tell the truth as a reporter on the beat. Whatever it is, you're telling the truth. And when you find yourself not telling the truth, or massaging the truth, or pretending that there are multiple different-sided pentahexagonal sides to the truth because you're afraid of taking a stand for the truth, then you've done screwed up. Then you've done lost your way. You've done taken the wrong turn to Albuquerque. I used this example in my small session. It's one that people have heard before, but like the point of the journalist is not to say some people think it's raining, other people thinks it's sunny. The point of the journalist is to look out the window and tell me what's happening. Mm-hmm. Like that's it in its most simple form. That's the news. It is right now sunny in my area. Boom. I've just taken a side, but that side is with the truth and not with and I'm not afraid from being called biased towards sunlight by telling the truth.
That's why I hate the term fake news, because by definition, news is not fake. That's called a fake story or a fake narrative. It's not news. And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we say, oh, that's fake news. No, it's disinformation or it's a lie.
It's a lie.
But don't taint the word news with that adjective. It's not fake news. But there are stories that are complicated, right? Stories that involve families coming up against different systems. I mean, just one example, and the system trying to wrestle with what to do, what's fair, what's not. And those stories get complicated. So is that then, what are the guiding principles to use in talking about the complications of life? Because it could be very easy to go down the path of saying the truth is black and white.
Yeah, nuance is important, right? And nuance is something that gets lost a lot online. Like, and I will freely admit, when I am on Twitter, I am not trying to be nuanced. I cannot be nuanced in 280 characters all that often, right? But when you give me 1,000 words, when you give me 1,200 words in a column in The Nation, well, then, yeah, I have a duty to be nuanced. I have a duty to wrestle with those complications. And again, in the service of the truth, show the readers what those complications are. So I'm not afraid of complications. Heck, again, I write about law. It's pretty complicated. It's pretty dense, right? I am often aware that what I'm trying to explain to people can be quite overwhelming. And my job, if I'm good at it, is to not dumb it down, to not smooth over the nuance, to not pretend it doesn't exist, but to do a good job of explaining it. And if, I have any talent, it's to explain it and then have a narrative enough that that explanation is still fun, entertaining, easy to read, and all those kind of nuts and bolts journalism 101 skills, right? But the goal is to explain that nuance in a way that people can understand it in service of the truth.
And in those complexities of individual people and their stories and their lives, there is something universal that you can find. And it seems counterintuitive, but storytellers, who even in cinema, do this, where they say it is all of these things are what make the story unique, but in the presentation of all of that, you actually find the thing that we can all connect to. And that exists.
Can I ask you a question though about this? Because you do more TV than I do. So how do you find the nuance when you're on TV, which, not to cast shade, but can be even a more reductive medium than others, right? Like, how do you find that nuance when you're literally got, a 90-second spot to make it all happen?
Choose your words, right? Words matter. I mean, that's what we do. We work with words. The words matter. I also, because I host, but I'm a correspondent. So I have to report. So in my duty to report what's going on with the Afghanistan war, the messy drawdown, I'm not just reporting what the Pentagon has told me. I'm reporting what Afghans are telling me and what they're feeling on the ground. So the information I share, I try to make it comprehensive or at least representative of the hearts, the people at the heart, or the people that get impacted by policy, right? So if that's my lens, people who are impacted by power, people who are impacted by policy, then I know what the 90-second nugget is that I need to grab out of my brain and spit out in that moment, right? It's the other one on TV, which I find very interesting, and it's a little clearer, I think, in the written form of the analysis opinion versus facts, right? So typically in a TV, one of the news shows, here's the correspondent who gives you the package. Then it follows with, okay, now I'm going to bring in guest so-and-so and muckety muck, and they're going to give us different perspectives on what we just heard. But if you're not aware of that, it all looks kind of the same, right? And obviously some shows are just all that. That's all they do. And I think that blurring of the line has not been a great thing. I think CNN and Fox have done it quite a bit to the detriment of us as a population, that this is the news piece. These are the facts, and even the facts, pick the right facts. Make sure you're giving the context of the facts. I think when you talked about explaining, that's the thing I think needs to be done better on television, which is not today so-and-so did such and such. It's like, well, what the hell drove so-and-so to do such and such? Has Putin done this before? Absolutely, he's done this before. In fact, in 2014, he did the same thing, and no one really sanctioned him. Right? There's a reason why today is what it is, and that is something that TV journalists can do better and strive to do better, is get that layer and context in, and out and done in a 2-minute piece. That's the big challenge. But we'll see. I mean, it looks like there's some major network executive shifts going on, and maybe one of them at CNN, Chris Lichts, mentioned that he wants to focus more on news, peel back the opinion. But again, even news, the facts you share has a lens, right? Yep. So the idea that lens can only come from, that objective is an older white guy, is part of the problem. It used to be that woman would get told you cannot write about sexual assault cases because you'll take it too personally. And Black reporters were told you can't write about race because it'll be too personal. I'm like, well, isn't everything else then like personal for, in some way, shape, or form for everybody? As opposed to you flip it on its head and you think, yes, you want the people who understand the nuance to help explain it to the public why this matters. So if your orientation is, why does this matter? I think you get to much better storytelling as opposed to if your orientation is, how do we keep everybody happy?
What you find, what I find at least, is when you're dealing with people who are basically everybody who's not a white cis hetero male, right? So every perspective that comes that's not from the white cis hetero male perspective gets tagged as opinion, gets tagged as non-objective, kind of regardless of what the person's saying. So it can be as simple for me. I mean, it's because it's happening to me today. It's top of mind, right? But if somebody goes on TV and says, the Constitution is great, that won't get flagged as opinion. That will get flagged as just a fact about American society, right? If somebody goes on TV like I did today,
to believe, right? It's that is our own cultural narrative, social bias, right? It is part of American mythology that the founders were great men who created an egalitarian system that you could work your way through and doors were open for anyone if they just raised themselves up by the bootstraps and worked hard enough. And that has crossed throughout American time, Democrat and Republican. It still exists today.
Right.
You went on television today and specifically said the Constitution is trash. First of all, how did it feel to say that on network television and not get kicked off air? And second, how did you arrive at that provocative phrasing to get to a far more nuanced argument?
Right. Well, first, I mean, yes, I went on TV and said that. And just to answer your question, it felt
It's on The View if you want to see it. And Ana Cabrera almost lost her brain.
It felt great. And then they follow, how can you say that? I was like, well, because the slavers and colonists and people willing to make deal with slavers and colonists to write the Constitution didn't do a very good job. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of fact. It is just a fact that the people who wrote the Constitution were exclusively white, exclusively male. Many of them held slaves. The ones who didn't hold slaves were colonists. The ones who didn't hold slaves and weren't colonists and were, perhaps in favor of abolition, were willing to make deals with monsters who held slaves and were colonists. Those are all facts, right? Now, we don't usually hear those facts. It was a bit like jarring for certain people, but those are facts. How I came to that conclusion, if you will, how I came to the point where I felt confident enough to say it is that I have the expertise, right? So like one of the, and I said this in my small section, so sorry if you're hearing this for a second time, but one of the things people have to understand, if you are going to be a columnist, if you're going to exist in the world of opinion, well, then you actually do need to have an expertise behind you, right? Like you can't just say like, whatever you want and then expect people to want to listen to you. You have to have a background and expertise, right? So I have a background in constitutional law. I've been reporting on it for X amount of years, blah, 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 blah. That gets me to the point where I can kind of say what I say and back it up. And that's that is the difference. And that is the thing that you don't really get in many mainstream organizations, the ability for a person who has my expertise and my background and my whatever to actually say that, because you see what happens, because people are so pressed, if you will, when their general white cis hetero male cultural assumptions are challenged. Again, from my perspective, the point of journalism is to tell the truth. The point of journalism is to challenge some assumptions. And that's what I do.
Again, we got there after many, many years. I do suspect that a younger generation has gotten there sooner. The fact that no one expects interns to work for free anymore, I think is amazing. I am not one of those people who's like, because I suffered, you should suffer too. Like the hazing that used to go on to earn your way to just do your job that you were already trained to do was unreal. Glad to see that's changed. But I suspect it has not changed. That if you're coming out of J school and you need your first job, you probably have to just do the job the way your boss wants you to for a while. So at what point, or how do you navigate the compromise that involves?
Well, I'll say this, you do need to have some humility so that you can learn something, right? My first editor was Edward Isaac Dover. He now is on The Atlantic. He had been at Politico for a while, but this is back when he was just starting out as the editor-in-chief of this small local paper. And he wrote me tough. He didn't like my flair, if you will. And he really just hammered it out of, like, I would submit, pieces to him, and it would come back and would just be like dripping in blood. It would just be just red and like eviscerated, and everything that I like about.
Well, because I think a good editor is amazing for writers, but again, it requires humility. What was the thing that you learned from that editor? Because I can tell you from my first editor, I learned very much to, like, I used to wind up, and he was like, that right there, 4 paragraphs down, that's the thing. So if you need to write the wind up, do that. Don't submit it. Yep. That's the start right there. So it's like, great, edit. And also not using the passive voice, which I think, like, right, like, just like literally I would write it in passive and past tense, and then be like, okay, great, just change everything now, right? So like the tricks of how to get it to where you need to be. What did you learn from your first editor?
First, the wind up, right? We're literally circle 2 paragraphs and be like clearing your throat. But even now, with my editor at The Nation, Lizzie Ratner, like, there are a lot of times where she's like, oh, look, here's your point, 3 paragraphs in. Yay. She's much more positive than Isaac was, but like same problem.
Isn't that awesome?
Exactly. Oh, look, you finally got to one. Excellent.
Let's help your readers find the point sooner, shall we?
But the other thing that he really taught me that I really did learn was that he told me, if somebody reads your topic sentence and doesn't read your kicker, you failed. Like you like, I don't know where you failed, I don't know how you failed, but at some point you failed at your job, because your job was to get them through to your kicker. And that I really did take to heart. And so, like, my writing is quite propulsive, right? Like I think very hard about, like, how to get you just from word to word, to say nothing from sentence to sentence, and then certainly from paragraph to paragraph. Like, I want you to need to read the next sentence, because I have this sense that I understand that what I am fundamentally asking people to do is crazy. Like, you have this whole life, you have a job and responsibilities, and I'm like, time out, I got a thought.
Listen to me.
I thought of something cool. Okay, ready? Want to hear it? I was like, you're going to take 5 minutes, 8 minutes to, like, stop your day to read. I have an obligation, right? I have an obligation to make that informative, accurate, but also fun and entertaining, and feel like you haven't just wasted your time. And so I think about that a lot when I'm constructing a piece, that I'm making a ridiculously large ask of a person to read it, and I'm trying to pay them off in some way. And I learned a lot of that from Isaac too, who, make no mistake, hated my writing, didn't like the sense that I was trying to bring, like, didn't think any of that was necessary at all. And so that's the other part of your question. You have to have the humility to learn what you need to learn, but also the kind of internal self-confidence to know what makes you interesting, what makes you tick, I had something to say. I had a voice that I wanted to bring. And so no matter what he told me, I was always going to be looking for a way to bring that into the conversation, right? He could never take that away from me, even if maybe he wanted to at certain points, right? So, like, you have to both have humility, but real, what I call internal confidence, right? Not the outward, like, I'm such a confident guy. That doesn't help you, but it has to really come from inside to be like, no, I have a thought here. I'm right here. I could learn about that, and I can be right about this at the same time.
For the younger generation, again, like, right, the idea that we don't need to go through the hazing, nobody should go through the hazing aspect of it, but there is a sense of learn what you can. And I always would pick jobs based on, what am I going to learn here? Not what am I going to get in terms of whatever, but like, what can I learn? Because that drives me. If I'm learning something, then I can put up with the other shit that comes with it. But there is also, right, an exploitative part of what happens in most career fields. And I want to read a quote from a New York Times piece recently, or a piece recently about the New York Times. It said, the New York Times editorial staff are forcing, I can't read my own handwriting. Are focusing, thank you. The New York Times editorial team is focusing on staff retention as policies about outside projects spark frustration. Quote, the longer you stay at a job that restricts you from outside opportunity, the less relevant your brand becomes. So let's pick about that first one, which is outside projects as a journalist at a specific entity.
Yeah. So first of all, Nayyera, can we just speak as adults? Like, that's some BS from the New York Times.
Well, but like, I want people to understand what it, right? Because there used to be the idea, well, still is, as many people, trust me, and the Twitter blew up on this, like, if you're a journalist, that's all you should be doing. What are you worried about that, right? Like, you are the job. And in government, I used to get this all the time, right? I didn't have a Twitter account because I was the job. If I had a Twitter account that would suggest something otherwise, then I didn't have the plausibility, if I had other opinions versus from the policy I was selling. Right. I was not allowed, and nor would it be advisable for me to have something outside of that. And very, very much people seem to have that perspective about journalists, right? That they should not have anything outside of that column.
Most of the talent at the New York Times, they poached from somewhere else. And by saying that the people who work there now can't have outside work, what they're trying to do is to keep other places from poaching them back. Right? Perhaps for more money or for a better opportunity or for more exposure. So it's a real level of hypocrisy from the Times. Look, we talked about how I got my first job, my first big break. You know how I got this job at The Nation?
How?
Lizzie Ratner, senior editor at The Nation, one of the most wonderful people I've met in my entire life, saw some tweets of mine and were like, that guy's interesting. And just cold email me. We don't know each other from Adam and Eve. Cold email me like, hey, would you grab a cup of coffee? Talk to me. And I was like, sure. And we started talking. We started chatting. And we kind of talked about whether or not I was a fit. And we talked about freelancing. While I had a whole other job, I freelanced here for a year. Mm-hmm. Outside work on the weekends, nights and weekends when I had time, right? Like, that's how I ended up with this particular job. Mm-hmm. The idea that in the modern world that you wouldn't let a writer kind of not just stretch their wings, because it's more than that. What I was writing for The Nation during that year that I was freelancing was stuff that my actual employer wouldn't have wanted me to publish, right? Publications have different sensibilities and brands, right? So when we're talking about people freelancing or having outside projects from the Times, you got to remember, we're talking about stuff that the Times itself will not support these people doing, right? So that even today, like if, I wrote, my last freelance piece was a movie review in the Washington Post, because we don't really come to me at The Nation for movie reviews, right? So like the idea that the Times is going to stop somebody from exploring their own interests for stuff that the Times itself will not publish is just, there's a level of cynicism and hypocrisy there that I find really off-putting.
Well, it's a very institutional way of looking at things, right? You're the company man, you're the company gal, that's all you can be. The irony, of course, is that, right, they do monetize all of the entities, right? Monetize the intellectual property that they get from their journalists, right? So if you have a journalist and then they're doing a podcast, the company owns the rights and all that, gets all of this money from it. And the person, the worker, the journalist doesn't. So that's what they were getting at with, the brand. Now, that idea though of a journalist having a brand, is that weird? Is that like trying to be an influencer journalist when really it should be just tell the truth?
Look, I think that it might have been weird 20 years ago, but welcome to the modern world that we're all living in. You have to be a brand if you're a journalist because you are your own distribution network. Yeah. Right? Like I tweet out everything that I write because my Twitter feed becomes a distribution network for my articles, at least as big as my employer's distribution network, right? Like I actually have through my cultivation of my social media feed, I have an ability to put out my stuff to a wider audience than any particular publication that I work for. So the idea that you don't have to be your own brand, it's just quaint at this point, right? It's kind of like saying at a certain time, you shouldn't need a car because you have this good horse and you should always take care of your horse. Like, okay, Grandpa, but it's the 1920s now. Okay, like
meanwhile, I'm sitting here with like an actual handset phone.
right? Like technology done moved, and you have to keep up with the times. So no, you absolutely have to be your own brand, as well as, you know, being part of the company. Again, you don't want to, you know, I'm lucky that I've never been in this situation. I have worked for companies where nobody embarrasses me. But I can imagine
you walked away from corporate big law. You just mean as a journalist.
As a journalist.
Yeah, no, I mean like right. You've had that experience of like, I can't do this anymore.
No, at corporate law, I embarrassed me when I was. That's a different lifetime ago. But I'm saying that, like, I'm talking about on the brand thing. Like, I would never use my brand to insult somebody else at my own company. Right, like you know, I'm a good enough kind of corporate citizen and not a you know, cynical enough to use it to attack a fellow colleague, right? But somebody else's colleague, man, I'll go. Let's go. Let's get into it, right? I have problems with that. Yeah, so like you have to being a company man or a company woman and being your own brand are not necessarily in conflict, but you really do have to be both in this day and age.
All right, so here I'm going to start diving into some of the questions that we're getting from our audience, and I thought related to the brand piece, because it's about who you are, what you think, and the voice you bring to the table. Question from Hannah: can you be both an activist in a movement and a journalist reporting on the movement? I'm going to go with no, but, and I say this. I think my job as part of the movement needs to be to tell the story then, if that makes sense, as opposed to, but I don't know, people wanted, there were journalists who wanted to go out and participate in Black Lives Matter rallies. Like, should they or should they not be allowed to do that? Are they compromised if you're participating as opposed to just reporting on it?
So I think the answer is yes, but. So
yes,
no, but I go with yes, but. Yes, you can be an activist and a journalist. But, and again, I said this in my small section, you can't let your activism and the narrative that you want to tell get out over your skis. You can't let your narrative overpower the narrative and the facts and the story on the ground. So as Melissa Harris Perry said earlier in today's conference, you know, one of the ways that you have to think about it is that you're amplifying other voices as opposed to your own. And when you are an activist journalist, that's really the right way to think about it, right? That you go to the rally, but when you go to the rally and then report on the rally, you're not reporting on what you did. You're reporting on what you saw. You're reporting what other people did.
And you probably shouldn't report using the voices of the people you showed up to the rally with, unless you disclose, hey, I'm telling this from a first person perspective, right? I'm going to go in and be like the gonzo journalism thing that Hunter Thompson used to do. Like, I'm going to go in and immerse myself in this, but I'm going to be transparent that I'm participating. I think that transparency is a key part of it.
Yeah, you're also just talking about ethics. And I think that one of the things that people lose when they are doing, when you have amateur journalists, I think one of the things that you see is a little bit a lack of those ethical concerns, not necessarily out of maliciousness, but just out of not knowing what those ethical rules are, right? So like in a former life, when I'm reporting on Occupy Wall Street, I go to Occupy Wall Street, right? Like, and I hang out at Occupy Wall Street, but every time I'm talking to somebody, I'm like, I literally had this like overly large legal pad that I would pull out just to be like, I am now in journalist mode. So if you want to keep talking, feel free, but just so you know. And that goes back to Isaac, by the way. I mean, that's just knowing what those ethical rules are. Amateur journalists don't always have. But yeah, I do think that you can be an activist and a journalist at the same time. And then certainly, which I think is even more perhaps to the point, if your journalism is in one area, you can absolutely be an activist in another area without even, I think, having too much worry about that. Where
I trust me, I'm going to be showing up to my kid's school board, like, right, like I'm with all the craziness going on. Like I will be one of those parents who shows up and be like, "Yo, what are y'all talking about?"
Right.
But I don't cover the education beat, right?
So there's
like I'm still a parent who lives in society, right? The idea that journalists aren't going to vote, I'm like, are you kidding me?
I mean, there's still journalists in this world that are just like, that think that it's a feather in their cap that they don't vote.
Yes.
And this is again where I say, like, no, be objectively pro-democracy. At this point in time, you know, and to the extent that people always want to be like, well, you know, in the 1950s we had, well, you know what? In the 1950s we didn't have an orange bigoted con man trying to overthrow the government.
Okay, you know what? In the 1950s we didn't have voting rights for people who look like you and me. So let's start with that.
Yeah, it's right. It's the argument. Like, what's politics to you are basic human rights to me. Yes.
Right. The thing you feel like you can be moderate about is actually my personhood and livelihood, which gets me to another question about personhood from Serena. Elie, so you go first, I'll go next. Elie, how do you deal with trolls who try to not only criticize your work, but your personhood? What have you learned about sticking by your work and your ideas?
Yeah, so again, I
suspect we might have a slightly different approach to this.
Right. I come from the blogging world, man. Above the Law, my old blog, we used to have open comments, man. Like I take that vein, like other people have adopted the darkness. I was born into it. I was born into the comment section. The comment section voted for me to have the job in the first place. Like that's where I come from. And so I have various strategies to deal with trolls. You're talking, Serena's talking specifically about trolls that kind of attack my personhood, my weight or my hair or whatever. I have that internal self-confidence. I love myself. I'm one of those guys that I'm that Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs, right? Like I look in the mirror and it's like, I do me. Like I just have that.
But I'm gonna bad example, but okay. I mean, like the idea of you having a skin suit kind of try to find a non-example of confidence, but
the other thing I honestly do is that like I basically like give myself the grace to absolutely blow up one of these people a day. Just like, you know, a bunch of negative comments. So I'm going to give myself the freedom and the opportunity to take one of those stupid people and absolutely torch them online at least once a day.
You make an example of a random person.
An example of them, right? Like I can't fight all of them, but you never know which one of y'all I'm going to destroy because I'm funnier and smarter than you, and you're going to feel it today, my friend. And then but it's random, so you never know if it's coming, right? But the last thing I'll say, and this kind of will lead into you, people need to understand, women especially need to understand, my worst day is not as bad as an average day for any woman online or in the public sphere in this space. Again, I know, because on my old blog, we had full-time women writers. And the worst I got in the comments compared to what they got in the comments every day, it wasn't even close. One of the reasons why we closed the comment section eventually was because just the thought that these women should have, you know, my colleagues, my friends should have to endure rape threats to go to work. You know, that would come in at the end of every single article they wrote. It's unsustainable. Yeah. And so, you know, I can have some fun with it and whatever, but like, make no mistake, what people do to women in this society, and especially in journalism, it's a different, it's not my story to tell.
It is a challenge. And it comes, again, I came to this after already having confidence in what I knew and my expertise. And even then it was very jarring to get, right? There's also another layer, particularly being on television, where I remember showing up for a CNN interview conversation. And for whatever reason, the makeup artist just put on like a bold burgundy lip. And I was like, oh, that's fun. Let's do that. Oh my God. My comments blew up for like 3 days about my lipstick. I'm like, seriously? Like no one actually cared about what I said? Like, oh, okay. Got it. That whole thing, right? I have a co-host right now, and I'll see him before the show, patting on a little powder. I'm like, that's all you had to do. This took an hour, like to look normal for television. So that's a whole other ballgame for television. And people, right? They'll go after a woman's physicality well before they'll go after anything she had to say, and it just is. So it takes thick skin, and depending on the medium where it comes from, when I publish, I don't read the comments. I don't mean Twitter. I mean, like if I publish a piece of writing, I literally have the discipline to never look at a single comment. Washington Post, Daily Beast, never looked at a single thing anybody had to say. Like, I'm not doing it. I'm just not opening up myself to that because there's no point. They're not real. To me, I decided like they're not real people, because these are not people who would actually dare to say this to my face. They are reacting to something that struck them in the piece. Great. I wanted them to feel moved, to have a reaction. They had a reaction. They are reacting to whatever other perception they have of me, but it's not really me. I also had the backing and confidence of an editor, right? So like, I know when I write, I trust, we've hashed this out. Somebody I respect liked this, thought it was good, it added to the conversation. Like, I didn't feel like an editor or something that I was throwing it out there and just the world was looking at it and tearing it apart. I'm like, no, this is something that I've had collaboration in, that somebody's like, yes, put this out in the world. So that piece gave me confidence. On Twitter, I block heavily, or if it's just like something genuinely, I don't know that I've actually singled out anybody to go at them, because I'm just not very good at that. I'm just kind of like, oh, okay. Like there's people who really, I was never the press secretary in government who had the great quips. I was like, well, let me tell you how the world works. Like, let me explain something to you, right? So that's my strength. So I do love, Elie, I love your Twitter feeds. There's just certain people who have great clapbacks. I'm like, that's not my strength. Never going to be. So block and mute heavily. Again, not necessarily real people, but it takes a beat, and you need to show up to it with confidence.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's just, it's an unfortunate cost of doing business. And I, you know, one of the things I also try to remind people is that when you see a woman journalist who isn't, let's say they're not clapping back, or let's say, you know, they are heavily blocking, just try to, if you're a man, if you've got the stunted Y chromosome, try to be an ally and try to help and try to be supportive of that, because you don't know what they're hearing, you don't know what they're going through, you don't know what I also as the guy, you're not seeing what they're seeing. You have no idea what our DMs are like. It's right? So bad. And half of it is about part of it. Like half of it is just about, because you even dared to show up in the space, there's like all sorts of weird sex stuff that shows up in my DMs. I'm like, like I just showed up. That's all I did. I did have, and I then used my access to this person. So there was a woman who had posted like how to communicate in international business. And somebody, a male friend of mine, tweeted like, see, this is wokeness gone too wrong. What the hell kind of stupidity is this? And she was talking about time zone sensitivity is what it was. And he never looked at her title or her job. And she was like, literally, like, I do international business. How do you communicate with people not in your same, like literally it was a very straightforward thing. And he took it out of context, quote tweeted her, and she had to close her account because of all the hate that she got. So I pinged him and I was like, hey, first of all, this is who she is. But like, do you realize what you did to her? Like you thought it was a funny quip, but do you know what that did to her? And pointed out, and he's like, oh shit. So he reached out and he apologized. I'm sure that probably helped her. That didn't help her mentions for 3 days, but like that type of thing. So when you say it's not just the man being an ally, but women who have male friends, and like, you know, it's part of that circle of just checking each other a little bit, like part of that social glue of society. Like you don't need to be objective about that. You don't need to be objective when you're watching someone get hurt. Yep. That's like the bottom line of that. Like you said, you are pro empathy. Mm-hmm. You don't have to make her prove that it's real today.
Yeah.
Right? No. So I hope that answers your question, Serena. I mean, like I wish I had a better answer. But it's part of the cost of the profession.
DGAF. This is an interesting one from Daniel. Who are working journalists right now that either of you find to be invaluable reading? It's hard to narrow it down, but going off what's said earlier in the conference, I'm just curious what successful journalists read themselves. Well, I appreciate being included in the context of successful journalists. I will take that confidence with me. Thank you. I read a lot of people in my beat, so I know what other people are writing. So in the foreign policy beat, specifically on the war stuff right now, I like Reuters, because they're very good about international. And so knowing who the State Department Reuters person is, State Department, the Pentagon Reuters person, but just like the people who are just factually reporting information, like I follow them religiously on whatever the issue is that interests you. And then you can layer on a list of like the analysts in that, the people who can add context and facts. So I do that. I also I use my media reading to just dive into universes I would never have been exposed to otherwise. And that's kind of what brought me to, that's actually what brought me to the Black News Channel, was just to see a majority minority newsroom, and to see what are the different things that changes in decision making and storytelling. That's been fascinating, actually. But Charles Blow is our primetime host, right? He's a 10 p.m. opinion show. And like, I just like listen and watch and I'm like, I would never have thought of it that way. So same thing with LGBT rights. I didn't grow up in a particularly diverse gender or queer diversity community. So that's following some advocates and expertise there. So I find that to be very helpful, is to use my reading time to get outside of my bubble, as opposed to affirming what I already think. Like, I mean, I grew up very socially and religiously conservative, and like, I'm totally turning into that hippie old lady who's going to have a flop house and be dressing out of Chico's as part of my life. Like, so like, this is quite a significant progression. And I really do credit that, for what it's worth, to exposure to a variety of different media and to just exposure to different people.
I mean,
who do you read?
Right. In my beat, I'm reading Dahlia Lithwick every day, everything she writes, every single sentence that she puts forth. I'm on her. I read that. I'm reading Imani Gandhi. I'm reading Kimberly Atkins. It's not an accident that I'm naming women right now, because people don't understand just how many great women there are writing about law. I'm reading Lena Littman. I'm reading Professor Melissa Murray and all that. I also read some of the guys, my boys, Mark Joseph Stern on Slate and Ian Millhiser on Vox. That's my beat. Look, I'm reading for fun Michael Harriot, because
he's so fun.
That dude.
Also, but I read him because he challenges. I'm like, I would never have thought of it that way. And he's funny.
Right. He's hilarious. He's deep. He's historical. People understand this. He has an economics degree. So like, it sounds like he's just doing like Black culture stuff. He's actually like Black economist guy. So like there's not a thing that I allow him to write that I don't have my hands on at some point. Right.
Jelani Cobb. I really like Jelani Cobb.
Jelani Cobb and Adam Serwer are my big picks for long form reading. Like if I'm going to read somebody over an entire lunch, it's going to be one of those guys. They do great. I'm going to give a shout out to The Nation. I'm reading John Nichols and Joan Walsh every day. Dave Zirin is my sports guy. Dave Zirin and Drew Magaray now on GQ. I read them a lot for sports. Look, the other with all of these people that we can say that we read and we do look at, I also think that it's really important to read the other side. Like if it's gonna,
yes,
like I will. I mean, not today. When it's really bad, like today, I won't. But like I'll read Breitbart now and again. I'll read Red State now and again. I want to know what my enemies basically are saying, not for the quality of their content, but I like to know.
All right, so here's my shortcut to that. Rather than giving them clicks on their website, I will just like see them on Twitter, or like somebody else will retweet them on Twitter, and that's where I get it.
But they're so much dumber in long form. I mean, like you don't really understand how bad their arguments are until you give them 800 words to repeat themselves and devolve into racism.
Oh, you know who else I've been really liking? And this is, again, I know very little about music. I'm also a sci-fi nerd. So I use a lot of my reading time to just literally get out of reality. And apparently I've done that since I was little. It was just get at it. So I love Octavia Butler. I think she's informed my writing, is Ursula K. Le Guin, N.K. Jemisin. The way they write about social science fiction and race, like the ideas of what it means to be in society in these alternate different ways, I have found to be very challenging and interesting. And so I love reading fiction. I'm not as much of a nonfiction reader as I think a lot of journalists tend to be. I'm like, oh, so-and-so wrote a book. Unless they're a friend, I ain't reading it. I read yours, Ellie. Don't worry. But I was looking at my Twitter feed, and I was trying to think of who else I could give a shout out to that you all might find interesting. And it just escaped me. Oh, Ellie, you're trending on the View clip. How about that?
Am I really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh God. So for this talk, I have my phone in airplane, so I don't know what's gonna be happening when I come back, but yeah.
No, so far it looks good. People, listen, you managed to be thoughtful and provocative, which is the Ellie brand, and that's a great brand to have. You let me know when you figure out when mine is. I'm still growing in this space.
I'll end for the students with this. If you find yourself doing TV, if you find yourself doing radio, please remember that you're only going to have 90 seconds, right? You're only going to have, 2.5 minutes to make your point. So like, think about what point you want to make, and there's no harm in practicing it, right? Like, I don't do this so much anymore, but actually I did do this for one bit of the thing that I said on The View today. Like, I practice in a mirror, like I'm an actor. Because I understand that I'm only going to have a limited amount of time to make the point. I want the point to sound right. I want it to come off right. I want to look right while I'm doing it. Because if you're on TV, that's also some nonverbal communication. You should be using all of it at the same time. And so don't feel bad about like practicing your lines like you would if you were reading a script. Because if you have the opportunity to make your point on television, you don't want to waste it.
And that actually goes to 2 questions from Madeline and Luca that I will combine, and we can close out on this, which is how do you hone the skills of taking a complex topic and turning it into a short TV spot? How have both of you built up the confidence to be in front of the camera? And it is that know what you have to say. If you don't have something to say, then you really shouldn't be doing TV or radio. You should have a point that you're trying to get across. 3 bullet points, right? And each one is one answer. What are the 3 things you're trying to say? Short points, practice that. I usually just have them written down. Just for me, the practice of writing gets it into my brain and then it just pulls it out. Having something to say is also have expertise in something. And that's why often you'll see the people who are contributors are people who've built up a body of work where even if the host, and I've been on both sides of this as a host too, like I know that there's people I can go any angle with, and the conversation can go there, but they'll have something smart to say. And that's because you've internalized the subject matter. You know the stuff well enough that you can find and give analysis or give perspective, something that's helpful to people in that. And then it's just repetition. I've had some really bad TV hits. Like I did Judge Prero. I should never have done her show. Right? Like it was horrific. But it's just the practice and the repetition. And for those who are looking to be in media television journalism, it feels silly when you're doing it, but on the other side, as a viewer, on the other side, as a host or your anchor, having that first sentence and your closing sentence, there's no way it sounds rehearsed. Even if you've rehearsed it, it just sounds good. Right. So get over the fact that it's rehearsed. It just sounds good. And it's very helpful. So I think those are just some of the quick tricks we can leave with you. I also would like to recommend, especially for women of color, minorities, and folks who are looking for just better networking, more skills and access that you may not get otherwise. Big fan of Pointer. I used a lot of their programs actually in the last year, even for my own training to get comfortable at the desk and find them to be just a lot of great senior journalists who are looking to give back. And they've got lots of immediately applicable tricks and tools of the trade. And a lot of their stuff for women and diverse audiences happens to be free. So use those resources, use them often. And that's all I have for you today. Would welcome you all to follow me on Twitter. I'll give a quick shout out at Nayyera, Nayyeror. If you do have cable, not many people do anymore, please do check us out on the Black News channel. I feel like I should say that since I took off from the show to join you all today. And I'm so glad I did. This was so much fun.
Cable, what's that? Do you have to
exactly?
You gotta go up on your roof and like put the antenna to the satellite?
Right. They don't know. Elie, they don't even know what you're talking about.
Yes. Thank you everybody so much for coming. Thank you for your interest. And keep fighting the good fight. Like one of the, if there's one takeaway I want you to leave about this profession, it's that it's worth it. Okay. Like it's hard and it's low paid and there's all these kind of problems with it, but it is so worth it. It is the fourth estate of government. If you look at our country right now, so many of what's wrong with it starts from a deficiency in journalism.
And so if you look at what's going on overseas,
and welcome.
If you look at what's going on overseas, it's the thing that authoritarians and fascists try to stop. Right? They try to stop people from telling stories that are different than what they want you to know. So
first thing they take away.
Thank you for doing this. And I'm so excited to see what each of you end up doing. And there's just such a wonderful career ahead of you in this new space of journalism.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Elie. Thank you, Nayyera. Yeah, you can leave, Elie. You've had a long day. He's done a lot. And thank you again. That was a terrific session. Thank you all for being here. That's a wrap. It's the end of the day. It's been a terrific day. I hope you've all appreciated it. We really do appreciate you spending the time with us. We know it's an extremely busy time. Many of you are doing midterms. Many of you have, all of you, many of you have a lot going on. So again, being here, not just being here, being so engaged. I've already had a number of the speakers, you text and email me telling them how much they appreciated your questions today. We really did want to give a lot of time to all of your questions, help frame the conversations. And we're all really glad we did. So yeah, again, we're grateful. We learned a lot. I'm fortunate enough to know all the speakers today. I learned a lot, but a lot of that came from the engagement that they had, from your queries, your good points, and your challenging questions. You all want to be journalists. You all are journalists, so stay challenging. For us, we hope you had a good day, as I've said, but the measure of success for the conference is really how we keep in touch. We really do want to be in touch with you. We do want you to pitch for Student Nation and for the Nation proper. We want you to apply for Nation internships. We're going to be rolling out new programs. We're going to have some new writing fellows that we hope you all will apply for and help us spread the word about. We hope, if the COVID numbers come down, to do more in-person conferences. We used to do them in person in New York City. We would bring students from all over the country to come meet with us. So again, we hope to come back to that, and we hope you will be a part of all of those things. So next week, we'll be sending you an email. We will give you links to all of this video. We hope you'll watch it again. We hope you'll share it with your staffs on campus, with those who you find, valuable allies in the media space. And again, we really hope you'll stay in touch. You'll let us know what questions you have. We'll let you know how to get in touch with everybody who you heard from today. And again, we hope you'll read The Nation, of course. Go to thenation.com. And again, just keep questioning, keep probing, keep up, this terrific intellectual engagement you showed today. And, I have some hope for the future. So again, thank you all. Stay well, have a good night, stay well, and stay in touch.